He thought he was knocking down a normal termite mound, but beneath the clay was a secret buried for 70 years. Today you'll discover what the farmer found and why someone started hunting him. Watch until the end, subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and tell me in the comments, what would you do? The morning heat of Queensland rose early, heavy and already clinging to the land like a second skin. Leo Hargreaves stood at the kitchen window of the old farmhouse, his hand wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, dry paddocks stretched toward the tree line, the earth split in thin, pale fractures from months without proper rain. Inside, the table was covered in unopened bills and a folded letter from the bank. The red stamps bled through the envelopes the same way they bled through his thoughts. He tried not to look at them anymore. Instead, his eyes drifted to the faded photograph leaning against the salt shaker, a picture of his father, sun-creased and smiling in a way that felt impossible now. On the back, written in pencil that had softened with age, was the line Leo had read too many times. Don't dig deeper than you need to. He didn't know if the warning had been meant literally or not, but he had no time to think about it today. A council subsidy was available for reclaiming overgrown land, and the eastern paddock, long abandoned and swallowed by scrub, was his last chance to meet quota before the bank took everything. And in the center of that paddock stood the giant Termite Mound. The locals called it the cathedral. Leo called it an obstacle he couldn't afford to leave standing. He stepped outside into the heat, crossed the yard, and climbed into his aging Komatsu excavator. The machine coughed, sputtered, and then reluctantly roared to life. As he maneuvered it down the rough track toward the paddock, he passed the fence line where old Mabel Auntie May to everyone stood with her enamel mug, watching him approach with narrowed eyes. "Morning, Leo," she called over the engine's rumble. "You heading for the cathedral today?" "That's right," he shouted back. Sweat already dripped down his temples. Time it came down. Mabel frowned and tapped a pinch of salt into the dirt beside her boot. "That thing's older than you and me combined. Leave it be. Termites build where the ground's stable, and not everything buried needs daylight." Leo managed a polite laugh. "You sound like my dad." "I should. He told me the same thing once," she replied. "Be careful, love." He nodded, then rumbled on. When he reached the paddock, the termite mound rose before him like a gray, petrified castle. Nearly 4 meters tall and wide at its base, its ridged surface looked fossilized, almost metallic in places. Some said lightning had struck it once. Others swore it hummed on hot nights. To Leo, none of that mattered. He needed the land beneath it. He circled the mound slowly with the excavator, the iron tracks crushing dead brush. The clay looked darker than most termite mounds, streaked with reddish flecks that glinted subtly in the sun. He lowered the bucket, testing the ground. Firm, no sinkholes. Good enough. He took a breath, then drove the bucket hard into the side of the mound. The impact cracked through the air like a rifle shot. Clay exploded outward, dust coating the windshield. Leo hit it again, harder. The mound groaned, shuddering like something alive resisting its own collapse. Chunks of hardened clay fell away, exposing the intricate inner labyrinth, the tunnels and cathedral-like chambers carved by termites over decades. For a moment he hesitated, feeling as though he was destroying a masterpiece. But he couldn't afford sentiment. The mound had to go. He continued tearing into it, sweat soaking through his shirt as the sun climbed higher. After nearly 20 minutes, the excavator's bucket struck something that wasn't clay. A sharp, metallic clink that vibrated through the boom and into Leo's arms. He froze. Machines didn't lie. He lifted the bucket, killed the engine, and climbed down. Dust hung in the air, settling on his boots as he approached the crater he'd carved. Kneeling, he brushed aside loose clay with his gloves. His fingertips touched smooth steel. He scraped harder. A curved edge emerged, then far more troubling engraved lettering, faint beneath grime and rust. Property of the Commonwealth do not open. Site B, 1953. What the hell, he muttered. This wasn't a drum or old farm equipment. It was a hatch. He cleared more soil, revealing 2 heavy latches and a recessed handle. The metal felt unnaturally cold, even in the heat. The dirt around it was packed tight, almost fused with time. No wonder the termites had chosen this place. They had built their empire over something stronger than stone. Leo fetched a crowbar from the excavator's cab. The latches resisted him with the stubbornness of decades, but then, one by one, they snapped. The handle groaned as he pulled. The hatch lifted slowly, releasing a puff of stale metallic air that smelled like rust and dead air. Below was a ladder dropping into darkness. Leo tied his flashlight to his wrist and descended. Each rung clanged under his boots, echoing into the hollow beneath. The temperature dropped fast, leaving the air cool and dense. The narrow corridor at the bottom was lined with peeling paint, old pipes, and rusted switches. His flashlight swept across a shelf, a notebook, leather-bound, surprisingly intact. He opened it. Names, dates, rotations. All ending abruptly in 1958, the last entry, scribbled in a shaking hand. Evacuation complete. Lockdown ordered. No confirmation from HQ. His breath hitched. A glint in the corner caught his eye. Metal boxes stacked neatly, stamped with faded red ink. Classified material, handle with care, Project Terra Depth. He didn't know the project, but he understood its secrecy. Too well. Then he saw the camera. A folding Kodak wrapped in cracked leather, with a roll of film still inside. He reached toward the fuse box, and a spark jumped. Lights flickered overhead, weak, yellow, ancient, but enough to illuminate the chamber fully. Only then did he see the heavy door at the tunnel's end, stenciled. B chamber. He walked to it slowly. The metal vibrated faintly under his palm, cold as ice. The latch wouldn't budge, and just as he leaned closer, the old fuse box began to buzz. Then the siren hit an ancient alarm, erupting through the corridor, metallic and agonizingly loud. Leo stumbled back, heart thrashing. Dust rained from the ceiling. The lights pulsed red. He ran, up the ladder, out the hatch, into the harsh sunlight. He slammed the hatch shut, gasping for air. But before he could regain his breath, headlights flared on the far side of the paddock. A large, dark vehicle idled at the tree line. Not a local truck, not a neighbor, a government black SUV. The engine hummed, low and ominous. Leo crouched behind the broken mound, pulse pounding. The siren below finally died. The headlights remained for a long moment, watching. Then they clicked off. Silence swallowed the land. Leo stared at the hatch glinting faintly in the fading light. He knew, with sudden clarity, that whatever had been buried down there wasn't meant to be found. And as he stood alone in the ruined paddock, dust settling around him, one thought echoed louder than the alarm. He had dug deeper than he ever should have. Leo woke to a silence that didn't belong to the land. It wasn't the honest quiet of early light before the magpies started up. It was a padded hush, like felt pressed against sound. He sat on the edge of the bed, palms to his eyes, and let the previous day flood back in jagged pieces, the iron hiss of the hatch, the ladder rungs trembling under his boots, the duty log smeared with damp age, the warning siren that shouldn't have had the strength to scream and yet did, and those headlights at the tree line, watching without stepping forward. When he finally stood, his knees answered with a farmer's stiffness, and a stranger's urgency. He boiled water he wouldn't drink, laid every scrap from Site B across the kitchen table, and forced himself to look at them as an enemy would. The brown notebook with the careful blue entries, the inventory sheet stamped with the old Commonwealth seal beside a column of coded crate numbers. The brittle forms where names were not so much written as erased. The little folding Kodak, its leather cracked like parched soil, but its shutter still wanting to live. He photographed everything, page after page, the scanner whining like a mosquito as it dragged light across the paper. He saved the images to a flash drive, then a second, then a third, because his gut told him 2 was the number a cautious man packed, and 3 was the number a hunted one trusted. By the time he reached the flatbed recorder squat, ugly, wrapped in oilcloth like contraband, the sun had shouldered past the gums and heated the corrugated roof until the house ticked and pinged. He threaded the tape with a patience he didn't feel, hands steady only because they had learned steadiness around fences that kick back and bulls that don't forgive clumsy. The first minute was only hiss and the distant thump of the recorder's motor, trying to remember how to be a heart. Then a voice arrived from the far end of the years, low and too close, as if the speaker had leaned into the machine the way a man leans into a confession. "My name is Samuel Hargreaves." Leo's breath stopped. The room narrowed. For a full 10 seconds he was a boy again in his father's kitchen, staring at the same family name carved into the cutting board with a pocket knife on a Christmas when money had been thin and hope had been thick. Samuel continued, halting at first, as if each word was a load a body had to deadlift. Project Terra Depth, 1956. We were told this was reinforcement science, a way to make ground safer, less fragile, under drought and flood. But the drills behaved like keys, and the stone behaved like a door. There are caverns under that shelf. We woke them. We were not prepared to quiet what we woke. Leo felt the house tilt, just enough for vertigo to lick his gut. The tape stuttered, scratched, found its groove again, and Samuel, his grandfather, whose portrait had lived humbly beside a salt shaker, spoke of voids that swallowed sound, of tremors local papers had called weather, of compensation letters that never left their envelopes because the envelopes were never printed. Then, as if someone had stepped into the room in 1958 to make him hurry, the voice shortened, sharpened. "If they shut this place, it's because the risks outlived the plan. They will bury it twice soil and signature. If you are hearing me, you are family, or you are a stranger allied to truth. Either way, treat the ground as if it remembers your footprints." The tape ended, not with a conclusion, but with a cough of static, a needle scratch of history, embarrassed at being overheard. Leo didn't move. The recorder spun on, empty, as if reluctant to admit the words had run out. He wanted to call his father. He wanted to ask 100 too-late questions. He wanted to return everything to the hole and pretend he had found nothing but termites living an honest life. Instead, he reached for the phone and rang the only person who could anchor the past to the present without romanticizing either. Mabel answered on the second ring, breath like gravel, voice clean as glass. "Bring the tape and the pages. Don't fold what's already fragile. And for pity's sake, don't drive the main road." He cut across windbreaks and dry creek beds and arrived at her gate with dust in his teeth and the recorder on the passenger seat like a sleeping dog. On the porch, she listened with her eyes closed, lips barely parted, as if the sound itself had weight she knew how to balance. When the tape finished, she didn't ask him if he was sure. She didn't ask him if this was wise. She only said, "You have 2 choices. You can become a custodian or a catalyst. Custodians keep the dead safe. Catalysts set the living in motion. Decide before someone else decides for you." He decided then and there that quiet would be an insult to the voice on the tape. "Tom," he said, "the Gazette. He'll think I'm mad until the paperwork touches his desk. Then he'll think I'm dangerous, and he'll still say yes. They split the load, Mabel with the newspapers she had hoarded against forgetfulness, Leo with the notebook and the forms and the duty log, and drove separately into town like a bad caravan, daring not to be one. Tom opened his door with a smile that failed on contact with the stamp on the first page. In 5 minutes the blinds were down, the office door locked, and his chatter had burned off like frost. He scanned while Leo talked. He didn't interrupt. He only paused once, at the ledger names and the years, and let out a sound that wasn't a laugh and wasn't fear, but the place where they overlap. "If we go all at once," Tom said. "No teasers, no soft open. We gather proof and we set every fuse to the same time. We don't announce a fire. We become one." They agreed on 2 days. 2 days to copy, to stash, to think about where men love to stand when they believe their badge is enough protection. 2 days to be smarter than men in polished shoes. The men in polished shoes didn't grant them one. They arrived after noon, just when the paddock heat made the world wobble and a man's guard drooped. 2 of them, plain clothes cut from the cloth of uniforms, bearing a card with an agency name Leo had never heard and a tone he had heard since school. "We'd appreciate your cooperation." "What do you need to see?" he asked, mouth dry, shoulders loose, the way you keep your body before a bull decides whether you're a threat worth hitting. "What you removed from the excavation," the taller one said gently, as if speaking to a witness scarred by what he'd seen and eager to be relieved of the burden of remembering. He smiled the way his father had taught him to smile at men who were sure they owned the sun. "You'll need a warrant." That word still means what it's supposed to, doesn't it? They left a card that was a card only in shape, climbed into a vehicle that was a shadow with wheels, and drifted back down the track like tide. Leo watched the heat swallow them and tasted copper. The trap had been sprung not to catch him, but to make him run. He did, but not away. He ran into the house, into the workshop, into the one room that still smelled of sawdust and diesel and the work that had made him. He made copies of copies, stacked printouts into envelopes, and wrote Mabel's name on one with a hand that put grooves into paper. "In case," he added, "because plain words carry farther than poetry when breath is short." By the time the sun slid behind the ridge, the farm smelled wrong. Not the honest smell of manure and oil and crushed grass. Sweet, sharp, chemical. He heard fire before he saw it, its ropey moan crossing the yard, then saw the glow curve against the workshop wall, a second sunset laid on with a dirty brush. He ran, hose in his fist, water coughing like an old man, and he fought the fire the way you fight a bureaucrat, with too little pressure, too little reach, and only a prayer that the wind would decide to be your friend. The straw bales surrendered in seconds. Paper turned to birds and then to black snow. He got the one thing that mattered out the recorder, and the rest he let the flames catalog as ash. He found the boot prints after, crisp in the soot like punctuation. He found the plastic cap from a jerry can, a small bright joke under the moon. He didn't find fear where he expected it. He found arrangement. So this is the music, he thought, and I've been pretending it was weather. He walked into the night humming the one truth his nerves had been telling him since the siren. Men were coming who wanted him to choose between silence and erasure. He had chosen noise. Now he needed a vault that looked like nature. He found it at the edge of the paddock, in the low mound that termites had started. Hours after he tore their cathedral down, proof that labor done together is its own stubbornness. There was a pocket under the wet clay where his thumb made a cave. He slid the watertight bag inside the duty log, the inventory sheet, the one page with the signature that had made Tom go quiet, a roll of film that had never seen light and closed the wound. He smoothed the clay with the flat of his hand and felt for the first time that day that the land might be on his side, not out of pity, but out of memory. At dawn, the courier came with a different kind of flame, The injunction wore its seal like a mask, apologized for the inconvenience with language whose corners had been softened by 1,000 previous uses, and then drove a spike into his life. Temporary federal claim, hazard assessment. Accounts frozen, access restricted. He laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the shape of the attack had become perfect. Fire for the body, paper for the blood. He took the envelope to Mabel and watched her eyes go hard in the way of a woman who has seen men trust the wrong kind of courage. "They're not escalating," she said. "They're narrowing the hallway. They will keep narrowing until your choices look like theirs." He told her about Tom's plan. She nodded once. "Good. Visibility is a kind of fence they don't climb easily." Then she limped to the back room and returned with maps that smelled like basements, school ledgers with attendance lines and paymaster notes, a handful of photos where the men in the front row smiled and the two in the back didn't. She placed them between them the way a dealer lays cards he would rather not reveal. "I kept these because the town needed someone to know what it had been told to forget. Now you need them because the town needs to remember out loud." The day unspooled itself taut and empty. Leo carried memory like contraband and rehearsed what a man says in a courthouse when he has never loved rooms with flags but has always loved the idea those flags pretend to guard. He ate bread he couldn't taste. He checked the termite mound and found it taller by a finger. He sat on his porch when the shadows grew long and listened to a wind that had begun to speak a new word. Tomorrow. He almost missed the knock. It was polite again, almost apologetic, and something in him wanted to mistake it for neighborliness, because an apology allows a man to think he still has power. He opened the door and met the same two men, their shirts unwrinkled by the day, the dust refusing to cling to men the way consequences refuse to cling to titles. "We have a proposal," the taller one said, voice lined with sugar and law. "We'll take custody of the hazardous materials now, and your accounts will be unfrozen by Friday. You'll sign an acknowledgement that you mishandled sealed evidence. We'll sign a statement that no further action is necessary." Leo pictured the termite mound, its red skin wet with acres of breath. He pictured his grandfather's voice asking strangers to treat the ground like a witness. "No," he said, gently enough to be mistaken for gratitude. "I'll keep what's mine, and you keep sending me your uniforms without uniforms. We'll see which of us runs out of shirts first." They left with faces that had stopped pretending to be faces. He watched their taillights until the road swallowed them, and then dialed Tom. "The drop goes noon," he said. "Not in 2 days. Tomorrow. You said visibility is a fence. I want a fence so high, even the men who build fences for a living get tired looking at it." "Done," Tom said, in a voice that had learned to be a tool. "Multiple outlets, offshore backups. Triggered release if you or I go dark. And Leo, don't be alone if you can help it." "I won't," Leo said, meaning it, not realizing that loneliness can be assigned to you by men with clipboards as easily as debt can. He pocketed a flash drive, slipped another into a coffee tin under the sink insulation, slid a third into the hollow back of his father's photograph frame, and wrote a short letter to no one. "If this reaches hands, publish. If it reaches Earth, learn." He placed it under the stack of bills that had once felt like his worst problem, and now looked like childhood. The night came in stamps, one at the tree line where the gums blackened, one across the paddock where the termite mound gleamed like fresh brickwork, one across his porch where moths smashed themselves over and over into the idea of light. Somewhere, a vehicle idled long enough to suggest patience. Somewhere else, a fox coughed. Leo sat in the dark with the shotgun and the recorder and did the most difficult thing a man can do after deciding to make noise. He waited without blinking. The knock didn't come this time. The retaliation did, but not against timber or paper. It wrote itself into absence. When he swung past Mabel's on his way to the courthouse at first light, the porch light wasn't just off, it was wrong. The kitchen chair lay on its side. The teacup her hands had warmed 1,000 mornings was belly up on the floor, its saucer a cracked grin. The back door gaped, not broken, merely persuaded. Her car slept in the driveway. The house's silence rang harder than sirens. Leo touched the table with 2 fingers and felt the cold the way a man reads Braille. He didn't call the local station. He had already met the peculiar helplessness of a town force asked to referee a game the rulebook didn't admit existed. He called Tom instead, voice lower than he'd ever heard it, and said words that moved the story out of caution and into vow. They took her. We publish at noon, and before noon, I'm going to take something back. He closed the door behind him and locked it out of respect more than hope. On the way to the truck, he paused, turned, and fixed the porch steps in his memory 3 boards, the third warped, 1 nailhead proud. The mind likes anchors when a body is about to cross deep water. He climbed into the cab and drove toward a morning that had decided it wasn't going to be gentle with anyone. By morning, the courthouse steps looked less like justice and more like a stage somebody else had built. News vans idled with their doors flung open, cables snaking across the pavement, microphones sprouting like reeds along the handrail. Leo parked at the far end of the street so he could watch everything before he entered. Who leaned, who pretended not to look, who kept their sunglasses on when the sun was behind a cloud. Tom stood under the jacaranda, purple blossoms stuck to his shoes, phone already vibrating with messages he didn't answer. He didn't bother with greetings. Noon, he said, soft enough that only Leo could hear. When the minute hand hits 12, the deck drops, all of it. Leo nodded, but his thoughts weren't on clocks. They were on Mabel's porch light, which hadn't been switched on the night before for the first time in years. On the way here, he had passed her gate and felt the hollowness of that unlit bulb like a missing tooth. He told himself she was fine because the story needed her to be fine. Stories were the only armor he had left. Inside, the courtroom smelled like furniture polish and old arguments. The judge, a narrow-eyed woman with the posture of a lamppost, sat high enough to pretend altitude was neutrality. Cole and Linton occupied the front bench to the right, their suits dark as threats, their faces politely empty. Their briefcases looked heavier than paper should make them. Clara Singh rested a hand on the stack of files in front of her, the same way a surgeon settles their palm on a rib cage before the first incision. "Breathe," she murmured to Leo, not looking at him. He didn't realize he'd stopped. The government attorney cleared his throat with the reverence of a man about to recite a prayer that ends other people's choices. "Your Honor, we move to seal these proceedings under national security privilege and to order immediate surrender of unlawfully removed federal property." Clara rose without haste. "Your Honor," she said, "we move first to establish whether the land in question is, in fact, federal. The Commonwealth requisition in 1956 was temporary and contingent upon closure of Project Terepth, a closure that by the government's own silence never legally occurred. Ownership reverted to the Hargreaves estate the day the requisition expired." A thin crack ran across the government attorney's composure. He reached for a sheet he had intended to reach for later. "We can present sealed documentation of continued authorization." "Present away," Clara said, and for a breath the room remembered what confidence sounded like. "And if you can't, the press remains seated. The public does not get expelled from its own story." The judge paused. She didn't look at statutes. She looked at pressure. "We proceed in open court," she said at last. Minutes turned into gravel. Motions rose and fell. Dates were thrown like stones. Signatures were held up to the light like old banknotes. Every time the word bunker was spoken, The air shifted in a way that had nothing to do with ventilation and everything to do with the way truth changes the temperature of a room. Leo kept his hands flat against his knees to stop them from curling into fists. At 11:58, Tom's phone vibrated like a trapped insect. He didn't look. At 11:59, he placed the phone face up on his thigh so Leo could see the black screen gather the reflection of the ceiling lamps. When the second hand kissed 12, Tom lifted his finger and sent every packet of proof he had spent 2 nights stitching together to every outlet that would accept a file bigger than fear. The first chorus of notifications didn't come from the gallery. It came from the council tables. Screens blinked, wrists buzzed, a bailiff flinched as his watch began to sing. Then the reporters started standing, and the room shifted from argument to evidence the way a dry paddock shifts to flame. Suddenly and then, all at once. Photographs of the hatch glinted across 100 devices. Scans of stamped forms, property of the Commonwealth, do not open flashed like contraband constellations. The duty log with lines of blue ink that stopped, mid-breath, in 1958. The inventory sheet with columns of crates checked out and never checked in. And the voice, a cleaned, amplified, terrible whisper of confession. Samuel Hargreaves speaking from a reel that should have been dust by now, telling a future he hoped would be braver than the past that silenced him. The government attorney moved for an injunction the way a drowning man moves toward a ladder. "Your Honor." "No," the judge said, one syllable like a door. "You cannot restrain what has already been published." Cole's jaw worked, but no word fit in the mouth he'd built for persuasion. Linton's eyes flicked to the back of the room, not looking for exits, looking for orders that weren't coming. A new vibration rolled against Leo's thigh. Unknown number. The message preview was only 2 words, alive, coordinates. Everything inside him tilted. He read the full text and felt the heat in his face drain like someone had opened a valve. "We still have her, alive. Bring the originals, no police. 28°40S, 150°56E, 2 hours." He stood. Clara's hand caught his sleeve and brought him back into the chair with a touch that looked like politeness and felt like steel. "Tell me," she said without moving her lips. "They have Mabel." His voice found a way out as a thread. "They want a trade." Clara's eyes darkened a shade, calculating risk the way pilots calculate crosswinds, with respect and inevitability. "You are not making trades. The trades are already made. They gave you coordinates because they just lost the court and need leverage. Make them show their hands." Tom was already typing one-handed beneath the table. "Say the word," he whispered. "We loop the locals, the state, whoever still remembers what a warrant looks like." "Loop them," Leo said. "And if they don't answer, loop the cameras." He left the courtroom at a walk that felt like running. The hallway tasted like dust and old varnish. Outside, the jacaranda shed purple confetti on his hair, and a woman with a press badge yelled his name in a tone that confused curiosity with entitlement. He didn't slow. Tom caught up at the curb, unlocking his ute with a beep that sounded obscene in the moment. "We're live, if you want to be," Tom said, lifting a camera no bigger than a wallet, better at seeing in low light than most people. "Not yet," Leo said. "If she's there, we don't make her a prop. We make her a person." They drove with the windows down, not for air but for sound, the kind of hiss a vehicle makes when it shadows you, the subtle change in wind when a second set of tires finds your dust. The coordinates pulled them off the highway onto a service road that hadn't been serviced since the drought. Dry reeds crackled against the undercarriage. The old pump house rose from the flats like a memory everybody had chosen to mistrust. Its door hung open with the theatricality of a bad stage direction. Inside smelled like wet concrete and old chlorine. She was there, bound to a chair, but upright, eyes bright, mouth unafraid. A bruise above her temple like a smudged thumbprint. "About time," Mabel said, the rasp of her voice more relief than reproach. "I was starting to think you'd brought a kettle." Leo crossed the room in 3 strides, fingers clumsy on the knots. "You all right?" "Better than you look," she said. "They don't know how to tie a real knot. Soft hands. Office hands." Tom moved to the corner and lifted his camera only enough to catch context, not humiliation. Footsteps entered behind the light. Cole and Linton stepped through the doorway without clipboards, without the borrowed clothes of authority, in shirt sleeves they hadn't expected to sweat through. Linton's right hand hovered at his jacket, where a jacket wasn't. "Remarkable persistence," Cole said, as if noting a lab result. "You could have saved yourself so much fire." "You could have saved yourself 60 years, Leo said. "But here we are." Cole's eyes tracked the camera like it was a third person with a vote. "Turn it off." Tom didn't. "We're on a delay," he lied, voice conversational. "Say anything terrible and we'll have time to bleep it." The pump house held its breath. Outside, the flatland pressed its ear against the door. Linton moved first, a fraction, enough to show intention. Tom's lens didn't flinch. Leo's hands lifted with nothing in them, and all the weight of the last 2 days behind them. Sirens didn't scream. They arrived like a decision the town had finally made, a low growl rising from the road and cresting into blue light that painted the doorway. Not the men who wore silence like perfume. Real police, dust on their boots, a sergeant who had once bought hay from Leo when her sister's mare was colicking. Somebody in the court, maybe a clerk who had watched too many families eat paper for breakfast, had tipped them. Cole's shoulders sagged in a way you only see when a man's story stops obeying him. Linton's hand froze inches from where his imagination had placed a weapon he didn't have the conviction to use under lights. They were cuffed with the ordinary metal that holds kings and drunks equally. The sergeant's jaw was tight enough to crack. "You'll come with us, gentlemen," she said, as if the title were a dare. "Unlawful detention, arson pending, trespass. We'll let Canberra find bigger words." In the ute afterward, Mabel held a bottle of water against her bruise, the cap off because her hands trembled when she tried to twist it. She refused hospital, accepted toast. On the drive to her house, she stared out the window at the flats where the country pretends nothing happens. "They didn't hit me," she said finally. "Not the way that leaves a story you have to lie about later. They just asked the same question over and over, like it would turn into a different answer if it got tired. Where are the originals? As if termites can't keep a secret." She smiled, small and sharp. "Termites have outlived governments." He brewed tea because tea meant normalcy, and hands had to do something that wasn't ball into fists. Her porch light came on when he flipped the switch, and the bulb did not blow. The glow landed on the table where old newspapers had been untied and retied so many times the twine remembered both shapes. "You made your noise," she said. "Good. Now they can't pretend you're a rumor." Noise had a price. They paid in the afternoon, when an unmarked envelope arrived at Leo's mailbox with a court letter that changed its name from injunction to audit, but still meant hand over your day. The freezes lifted in the evening after Clara sent a letter with more edges than courtesy, and 3 outlets ran editorials with headlines that felt like a prayer. "Sunshine is cheaper than silence." By dusk, the paddock held a new sound. The kind of hush that comes after a storm that didn't quite break. Leo walked to the ruin of the shed and pushed his boot through ash that drifted like gray snow. He knew what had been lost and what had been multiplied. The dead man's switch had made copies a weapon. The whole deck had been thrown down at once, and now 1,000 hands held a card each. To gather them, you'd have to collect the continent. He stopped at the mound he'd chosen as a vault. The termites had worked the day like payroll depended on it, lifting lozenges of clay from the earth and setting them with mouth and patience into a red cathedral that already remade the ground's memory. He placed his palm against the warm wall, feeling the faint tremor of a city at work. "Thank you," he said to insects that didn't care about gratitude. His phone buzzed again. "Clara." Injunction lifted. "Land recognized as yours. Pending audit." Federal Review announced. "Their language is weasel-tight, but it's an admission. Don't celebrate. Breathe." He breathed. He didn't celebrate. He thought of Samuel's voice dragging itself across the tape, like a man pulling himself out of a hole he'd been told was not there. He thought of the sentence underlined twice. "All findings are to remain sealed." He thought of the paper that had never received its final signature. And he thought of the new message Mabel's neighbor had just forwarded somebody leaving a package at the post office counter, with a cash stamp and a fake name, the kind of move no one makes unless they want what's inside to move quickly. The package waited for him in a pigeonhole with a rubber band hug. Inside, a key that looked like it had never met a pocket, a tag with a string, and an alphanumeric code stamped into metal, and a note in a fast hand that didn't care about elegance. "If you want the truth, stop staring at Site BC is where the bones are. The coordinates are in the file you didn't open. Yet." He turned the key under the streetlight and watched it flash once, like a fish in shallow water. The future tilted toward him the way a hatch does when you've loosened the last bolt and gravity takes an interest. He slid the key back into the envelope and didn't tell Tom, not yet, because the body needs a night between wounds. He went home by the long track, the one that lets the paddock walk beside you, instead of you walking over it. When he reached his porch, the first stars had already pinned themselves to the sky. The kettle rattled on the stove. He stood at the back window with his palms against the cool glass and watched the dark shapes of the termite city breathe. In the morning, the press would arrive again, with questions shaped like nets. The government would release statements shaped like fog. The men who had worn their confidence like clean shoes would be replaced by men who wore theirs like masks. Site C would wait in whatever geography the past had left to hide in. Tonight he listened to the land remembering itself. He let the siren in his head die out. He let the fear that had run bone deep since the hatch first breathed air dissolve into a kind of resolve that didn't shout. It made a quieter sound, the one that timber makes when it bends and chooses not to break. Mabel's porch light glowed in the distance, a small star on a small road. He could see her silhouette move past the window, steady as a metronome. He smiled at that. Then he sat at his table and opened the notebook he had stolen from time, the duty log with the names and hours of men who had stood watch over a secret that had outlived their lungs. On the next blank line, he wrote his own name. He wrote the date. He wrote the hour he had chosen not to be afraid. Outside, the termites kept building. Inside, he kept breathing. The truth, now that it had air, did what truth always does when finally allowed above ground. It started to grow. The courthouse smelled like polish and paper lies, the kind that pretends procedure is stronger than power. Leo stepped from the sun into its dim corridors and felt the pressure change, as if the building swallowed noise to listen for confessions. Tom was already waiting near the double doors, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, phone vibrating every few seconds with texts from editors who had promised courage and were now asking for certainty. There was no certainty left. There was only timing. "Everything's cued," Tom murmured. "Noon sharp. If we blink, we lose the angle, and they turn you into a reckless farmer who mistook a storm shelter for a myth." Leo nodded and kept his eyes on the entrance to the courtroom. He saw them before they saw him. Cole and Linton. No clipboards today. No borrowed agency names. just that still, trained posture that said they were most dangerous when quiet. They brushed past as if he were a coat rack. He watched their reflections glide in the glass of the doors and thought of ash drifting from his burned shed, of Mabel's shattered teacup, of his grandfather's voice on the tape hissing through 5 decades to say, "They never let go." Inside, the room was smaller than television makes such rooms look. Lower ceiling, duller wood, faces too close together to pretend indifference. The judge wore her hair like a decision and surveyed the gallery with a gaze that weighed risk before law. Reporters filled 2 benches, locals a third. The remaining bench belonged to the government, vacant except for Cole and Linton, and a woman with a briefcase that looked expensive enough to have its own passport. Clara Singh touched Leo's sleeve. Her words were almost a whisper. "We keep this open. If they close it, you and I become a rumor." The government attorney rose first, the voice warm with practiced reassurance. "Your Honor, in the interests of public safety and national security, we move to seal this hearing and restrict all discussion of—" Clara was on her feet before the sentence found a period. Respectfully opposed. The requisition that created Site B expired more than half a century ago. There is no deed, no statutory renewal, no record of closure. If the Commonwealth believes otherwise, then it admits to occupying private land covertly for 67 years. Sealing this hearing would compound the violation. A murmur ran the room's edges. The judge lifted a hand, and silence fell like a gavel that hadn't yet dropped. "Motion to seal is held in abeyance," she said. "Proceed, and we will see whether the law or the facts require a closed door." Proceed they did. The government's counsel spoke of potential contaminants and unverified records and the need to protect public calm. Clara replied with dates, statute numbers, and a copy of the family ledger whose tidy handwriting crossed 3 generations, each line a season harvested and a debt paid late. Leo sat still and watched the strange theater of it, how a person's life could be folded into exhibits, and exhibits could be made to mean almost anything by a mouth trained to steer them. He didn't realize his hands had clenched until the phone in his pocket buzzed once, a phantom reminder of the clock. Tom, 2 seats away, glanced at his watch, then at Leo, then at the judge. It was 11:58. Cole's profile was a cliff. Linton's eyes kept moving. Door, bench, reporter, door, as if calculating exits through air. The government attorney began the argument for an interim injunction on the land, the same one already mailed, now dressed in courtroom clothing, and the judge's pen hovered above a blank line, 11:59. Tom's thumb woke the phone in his palm. Leo thought of the mound rising again at the edge of the paddock, of the soft, wet clay he had pressed smooth with his own hands, of the way silence can feel like a choice until it becomes a cage. He gave a single nod. Noon arrived as sound, a scatter of buzzes, then a wave of them, then the brittle chorus of push notifications chiming across the benches like a spill of glass. Screens lit up. The buried Project Queensland farmer uncovers secret Cold War site. Photos of the steel hatch. A scan of the ledger's cover stamped Duty Log, Site B. A clip from the tape. "My name is Samuel Hargreaves." The headline reached the hallway, the street, the town, and then the country in the time it takes a finger to tremble. Reporters stood, phones rose, a few whispered apologies that were not apologies at all. The government's counsel asked for an emergency block. The judge did not look away from the bench. She simply said, "You cannot restrain what has already entered the public record. Sit down, counsel." Cole's jaw flexed. Linton's hands, those unfailingly steady hands, twitched once. Tom kept recording, the small red light a dot of heat in the cool room. Leo's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. The message was small. "We still have her. alive. Coordinates, a string of numbers near the old pump house that had dried to a mausoleum during the last drought. He felt the room tilt a degree and right itself. He let himself breathe once and showed Clara the screen under the table's lip. Her eyes went sharp. "We can request police accompaniment," she whispered. "We can," he answered. "But by the time they decide who's in charge, she becomes a story we add to the next chapter." The judge spoke. The words floated past him. Motions denied. Property status to remain with the Hargreaves estate, pending federal proof. Any federal proof to be submitted within 7 days, under open review. It was a small victory dressed as a larger one. It was also cover. The spotlight would remain pointed at this courtroom while other things moved in shadows. He rose when Clara rose and left when she left. In the corridor, Tom caught his arm. "You got it." Leo showed him the message. Tom didn't waste useful seconds with shock. "We go together. We stay on camera." They did not run. Running draws attention from the wrong watchers. They walked fast through the courthouse doors into a sun too bright to feel safe. The street hummed, engines, voices, satellites. A reporter called Leo's name. He didn't turn. He and Tom slid into the ute and drove a route composed of habit and caution, swapping highways for back roads where scrub gum threw longer shadows. The pump house leaned like a tooth, pulled sideways. The door hung on a hinge and smacked itself in a wind that didn't change direction. Leo parked beyond the sightline and listened. Birds. Grass. The small mechanical whisper of Tom's camera spinning up. "Live," Tom said. "Not announced, just rolling. If they break it, it breaks everywhere." Leo stepped first. The concrete smell was the same as every abandoned building in the world. Mineral breath and mildew and the echo of things that used to matter. He didn't say her name. Names call attention. He turned a corner and saw her. Mabel sat in a chair that had been a chair before someone turned it into a knot of rope. The bruise above her temple was the kind that blooms across a week. The eyes below it were the eyes that had told him stories on a porch and warned him that termites built where the ground didn't betray them. She lifted her chin the way a person does when their body is tired, but their dignity refuses to rest. "About time," she said. He exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. His fingers knew knots. He made them unknow themselves. "Can you stand?" "I can walk. Standing is just the dress rehearsal." They moved slow. Tom kept the frame wide enough to catch the room and the door and the surprise entering through it. The surprise was Cole and Linton. Their suits belonged to a world that did not expect to kneel. Their faces belonged to men who had run out of options they trusted. "You've shown persistence," Cole said, and the sentence arrived without heat, only gravity. "It's a shame you didn't apply it in private." "It's a shame you thought secrecy would survive daylight," Leo answered. Linton's jacket shifted half an inch. Tom widened the frame so that half-inch became a question every viewer could ask at once. "We're live," Tom said. "If you brought a quieter argument, it won't be quiet." Cole's eyes slid to the camera, then past it, then back. He had miscalculated, but he had not lost his core belief that institutions forgive their own and that the news cycle has the attention span of a gnat. "A week from now," he said, "this is a footnote. A month from now, a myth." "Perhaps," Tom said. "But the algorithm is cold-blooded. It eats what it's fed. Today it's fed you." The sirens were not theatrical. They were late. Headlights spidered across the concrete. Tires crushed grass. The real police came in fast, voices structured for command, hands arranged for both the camera and the report that would become a file, that would become a hearing, that would become a career note. Cole and Linton did not fight. Men like that only fight when the outcome is certain. They were cuffed, red, escorted past a camera that did not blink. Outside, air felt like water. Leo walked Mabel into it. The sun put color back in her bruise, the kind of rude honesty daylight grants. She rested a palm on his arm and spoke like she always had, plain as bread. "You can stop apologizing," she said, without waiting for him to start. "I chose to stand on that porch with my old newspapers. I chose not to lock my door. I chose this trouble for the same reason you did. The ground remembers." He nodded and looked past her at the flat far distance where the paddocks ran together and the sky pressed down on all of it. Somewhere out there, the mound he had chosen as a vault was drying into a hard red cathedral, and inside it, wrapped in watertight certainty, sat the originals he would not retrieve until the right day asked him to. They gave statements that were more like punctuation than paragraphs. The officers took custody of Mabel's ropes as if they were evidence and not an insult. Tom uploaded 3 minutes of raw footage before his battery brushed empty. The platforms did the rest, multiplying the video into mirrors and then into light. By sunset, the courthouse looked different without people. The judge had gone home to a life that would not allow her to speak at dinner of the way the room had tipped at noon. The government attorney had typed an email that contained the word context 4 times. Cole and Linton had found themselves in holding cells named after numbers, not men, and in Leo's kitchen, smaller than any of their offices, sat a stack of printed articles that tried to sound measured while their headlines screamed. He drove Mabel home and fixed the loose hinge on her back door, because he needed to fix something with a screw and a sound. She made tea one-handed and scolded him for staring at her bruise like a boy who hasn't seen weather before. He laughed then, a short, honest laugh that startled them both. On the way back, his phone filled with a different genre of noise. Lawyers whose names were vowels and iron, politicians discovering their concern in real time, neighbors offering casseroles, strangers offering opinions, reporters offering platforms. He ignored them all because the one thing that mattered had no ringtone. The land would not be taken a second time. Not by papers, not by fire, not by men who introduced themselves politely. He parked by the house and stood a moment in the blue hour where edges soften and sounds carry. The paddock breathed. Insects tested the envelope of dark. Far away, a dog performed its inventory of night. He could have gone inside. He could have slept. Instead, he walked the fence line, slow, quiet, listening for engines that were not cicadas. He found only stars and the low tremor that lives in a man's chest the day he stops flinching. The next morning broke like glass. News vans returned with longer aerials. The postman wore the face of someone who knew he had something to deliver that would make a man swear. The envelope arrived thick and official, its seal the kind that buys obedience from a distance. Inside, notice that the injunction had been lifted pending review. Acknowledgement that a historical research infrastructure existed under the Hargreaves property, and that records had not been fully reconciled. Assurance that the Commonwealth would conduct an internal review. It was an apology that never learned the word sorry. It was a retreat that would be called a clarification. Tom read it at the table where Leo's father's photo still leaned against the salt. "They're cutting their losses," he said. For now is enough to plant," Leo said. He returned the letter to its envelope and set the envelope beside the notebook that had become a map to the past and a weapon in the present. He wanted to open the camera film right then, to rush the images out of their coil. He didn't. Some things you take in the order they were earned. Late afternoon carried a quiet, not born of fear, but of distance. When the courier came again, he did not meet Leo's eyes. The package he handed over had no sender, no stamp that mattered, just weight. Inside, a small metal key on a string, tagged with an alphanumeric code, and a single handwritten note that did not smudge. If you want to understand how far the project went, don't look at Site B, look for Site C. Coordinates enclosed in the file you haven't opened yet. The story isn't finished. He let the key rock in his palm and catch the light like a fish thinking of the surface. He could feel the tug in his bones, the part of him that walks toward closed doors, because closed doors don't stay closed without a reason. He closed his fist and set the key beside the ledger and did not reach for the file that he hadn't opened yet. Not today. Big truths must be planted, watered, allowed to root. Tear them up too soon and they die in your hand. At dusk he drove to the edge of the paddock and stopped where the red cathedral was thickening into architecture. Worker swarms stitched sunlight into clay. The mound had grown a shoulder, a curve, a shadow that promised height. He laid a hand against it without pressing, like touching a sleeping animal. Beneath his palm lived the originals that had started this cascade. He whispered a thanks he would have been embarrassed to say out loud. The mound did not care. It accepted the task the way weather accepts instructions only from the moon. On the way back, he passed Mabel's fence. She was on the porch with her enamel mug and the shawl that had been old before he met it. She lifted the mug in a salute that looked like yesterday and the first story she ever told him. He lifted his hand in return and thought of the inscription he had carved into the post beside the mound. This land remembers. He hadn't known, when he cut the words, that they were a vow. Night rose. The house embraced shadows the way a man learns to live with a scar. Leo double-checked the latches, turned off the lamps, and sat at the table one last time with the ledger, the tape, the printed scans, the envelope the government had written to itself. He did not mistake today's reprieve for forgiveness. He understood the lives of secrets. They adapt, mutate, recruit new guardians with new titles. But he also understood something secrets have always hated: noise. Tomorrow would belong to statements and meetings and slow men reading faster than they think. Tomorrow would belong to lawyers exchanging paragraphs like chess pieces. But tonight belonged to the farm, the creak of the roof finding its cool shape, the buzz of the freezer, the feathered rush of a magpie cutting the dark. He breathed with those sounds until his chest learned their rhythm. When sleep finally took him, it didn't steal him. It lowered him, like a winch that knew the weight it bore. He dreamed of ladders and doors, and of a voice on tape that had traveled farther than voices are built to travel. My name is Samuel Hargreaves. He dreamed of clay rising cell by cell, of engines turning over and fading back into the nothing that had previously claimed them. He dreamed, without fear, of a key on a string and of coordinates that would wait because he told them to. The morning would bring letters that used new fonts and old strategies. The week would bring hearings that tried to dress scandal as oversight. But tonight, between the breath and the thunder of headlines, the farm found its quiet again. And out by the rebuilt cathedral, the new secret slept where insects stand guard better than any safe ever made by men. By the time the headlines thinned to columns and the cameras retreated to other storms, the paddock had learned a new kind of quiet. Not the drowsy hush of heat and insects, but a deliberate, listening silence, as if the land itself were waiting to see what men would do next. Leo parked the ute at the broken fence line and cut the engine. The afternoon light lay on the grass like old varnish, thick and golden, catching in the thorn bush and spider webs strung between rusted wires. When he stepped down, dust rose around his boots and hung there, undecided. The Termite Mound, the new one, stood half a man high beside the cratered footprint of the old cathedral. Its surface had firmed, the wet clay baked into ridged, armored flutes that spiraled up like the twist of a seashell. He set his palm to it, feeling the faint tremor of a million small intentions humming beneath. The bag of originals slept inside that fortress now, sealed in a casket of red earth and spit. A safe built by a species with no words for betrayal. He left it undisturbed. Some truths were safer when they were part of the soil. The rulings had come quickly, faster than he'd believed paper could move. A judge's signature lifted the injunction. Another compelled the custodians of forgotten archives to produce an inventory of everything labeled Terepth. The department that sent men with clean shoes issued a statement composed entirely of commas and caution. Cole and Linton were charged with what could be proven today, while investigators went looking for what might be proven tomorrow. It would take months, years, to audit 60 winters' worth of missing signatures, but the ground had shifted. The secret wasn't buried anymore. It had a file number. Mabel had returned home the same evening the court stayed open. Home, but not unchanged. The bruise ripened along her temple like a dark plum, the only visible debt. She took to keeping her porch light on and her kettle full, not because fear likes tea, but because ritual does what courage cannot. She would sit in the doorway and watch the gum leaves turn their pale undersides to the wind and say, "It will come good." Whether she meant the land or the story, Leo never knew. In town, people had started talking the way they always had, just not at the same volume. Some nodded to him with the wary respect given to a man who has survived a thing others would not choose to see. Others crossed the street, uncomfortable being cast in the background of a headline. Tom walked beside him without angles, measured in his stride like he'd trained his body to balance what his mouth had already promised. "It's out there," he kept saying. "They can't unprint it." He looked thinner and older and more fully himself. At the Gazette office, the front page from Noonday stayed taped to the window, long past custom. The photograph of the hatch gleamed a mean nickel gray, a circle in the earth like a coin halfway swallowed. Under it, the caption carried dates. Dates made things real. Dates made men accountable. And yet, it is a strange adjustment to live on land that has become an argument. The farm felt both larger and smaller. Larger because he could feel the invisible corridors under his fields, steel ribs and dead switches extending beyond his fences into a map the newspapers had not yet traced. Smaller because every step seemed to make a sound now, and Leo found himself listening for echoes that didn't belong to the surface world. He checked locks that had never needed checking. He learned the timbre of the night by heart. Kookaburra laughed there, magpie 2 trees over, fox cry in the creek bed, wind scudding dust against the tank. Anything that didn't fit, he woke. One dawn, a white envelope lay on his kitchen table where he did not remember placing it. He stared at it a long time before touching it. No return address, no stamp. Someone had walked this paper into his house and set it down like a glass of water on a bedside. Inside, a single key and a note written in a hand that did not want to be recognized. If you want to understand how far the project went, don't look at Site B. Look for Site C. Coordinates enclosed in the file you haven't opened yet. The story isn't finished. Below, a line of block-printed letters and numbers tagged to the key, and a second set of coordinates lat long that resolved in his mind to a memory of red hills and a dry creek where cattle never lingered. He didn't look up the place on the computer. He didn't tell Tom, not yet. He slipped the key onto his ring, and the weight there changed the way his hand hung, as if every movement he made after would have a new hinge. He went back to work the way men always go back to work when the ground refuses to produce anything else. He mended fence, rotated what cattle he still had, and reseeded the eastern paddock where the cathedral had once stood sentinel. The council subsidy finally arrived after a bureaucratic detour. Someone up the line had unfrozen what a different someone had once iced. He did the maths late at night with a pencil stub and a kind of grim optimism. Survive the season, make the mortgage. Trust that the weather would forget to be cruel. He had been wrong about a great many things in his life, and right about fewer. He hoped he was right about this. On Thursdays, he took the ute into town with a box of eggs and a list he would always lose halfway down an aisle. On Sundays, he sat at Mabel's table over scones that could prop a door open and listened to her sort out the past the way other people sorted out drawers. They always called it progress, she would say, stirring, as if that were a compass point rather than a word men used to excuse not looking back. She would push a stack of brittle clippings toward him. Names underlined, places circled. It's not just about your grandfather, Leo. A thing this large leaves a wake. Look for the ripples. He looked. Some days the ripples were obvious. A veteran who remembered being paid cash and told to sign nothing. A ledger with a torn page where a supervisor's name should live. A photograph where the shadow of a fence marked the boundary of a place no map acknowledged. Other days the ripples were silence itself, the way a clerk folded a file closed when he walked in, the way an official spoke to him like a rural myth that might embarrass someone at a desk. It might have ended there. A man with a farm and a file number, holding a piece of metal like a promise he wouldn't make aloud. It might have softened, like paint in sun. But stories that choose you don't wait for your convenience. They came back once more, not with polished shoes or forged letterhead, but with the nervous pace of men who had discovered the world was watching. A pair of contractors contracted by contractors' men who believed their invisibility clause protected them. They parked at the far fence line and walked the property on a Tuesday like tourists, pointing at trees as if identifying birds. Leo kept working the trough in the next paddock until one of them finally stepped toward him and said, "We're here to assist with remediation." "Of what?" Leo asked, turning the spanner in his palm like it was part of the sentence. "Legacy infrastructure," the man said, as if the words were cardboard. "That infrastructure is under audit," Leo answered. "If you touch anything, you'll be the ones on the news this time." They left. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from someone who did have a name, warning him that informal crews might try to access the site and to notify a liaison who had suddenly appeared to liaise. The world had shifted indeed. The same machine that burned his shed now wrote memos asking permission to enter his field. That night, unable to pretend sleep would perform any of its advertised miracles, he took the key out to the new mound and knelt. He did not dig. He spoke. "Granddad," he said into the dark, feeling deranged and completely sane at the same time. "I opened it. I'm sorry and I'm not. I did what you tried to do and failed to do, and what you told me not to do. I don't know if that makes me stubborn or ungrateful or both. But I am listening now. If there's more, I hear you." Wind moved across the grass like a shoulder. Far off, a truck took the highway bend slow, amber marker lights blinking like small patient eyes. He stayed until the stars thickened, and the cold reminded him, there is an animal part of a man that does not give a damn about destiny. It wants a blanket and a locked door. The next morning he drove to Tom's office with 2 coffees and a decision. He set the key on the desk between them. "There's another site," he said. "See." Tom didn't jolt. He compressed. "Anonymous." He nodded. "And no, we don't go out there with a shovel and a camera like we're making television." "We go with law," Tom said, quick, already drafting the shape of it in his head. "We document, document, document. We request escort. We invite everyone who can't pretend they weren't invited. If it's nothing, we say so. If it's something, no one gets to say we trespassed our way into it." "Good," Leo said. He hadn't known until that moment what answer he needed to hear. They spent a week assembling the scaffolding an honest visit requires. The liaison was delighted to liaise. A member of parliament agreed to observe if schedules allowed. A professor with field experience in Cold War civil defense phoned to say he would come for history's sake and for my sins. Mabel insisted on riding out with them and was told, flatly, no. She said she would sit on her porch and watch the wind and pray for their tires. The coordinates, when finally pinned to a map with the right layer toggled on, marked a dry gasworks pad gone to grass, 20 kilometers from the Hargreaves boundary. No structures remained, not even the courtesy of a ruin, only a level oval of ground where the soil's color ran wrong. On the day they went, clouds gathered in a high white lid that turned the light to tin. Leo drove second in the short convoy police, then him and Tom, then the liaison and the professor, then a truck with no markings full of men who refused to be either friends or enemies until the camera told them which. They parked well back. They walked the last 100 meters in a silence that does not belong to ceremonies. The professor crouched and pinched soil, sniffed it like a winemaker. "Someone scraped this clean sometime in the last 10 years, he murmured. "There's nothing to see because they took away everything that would remember." Tom filmed without narrative. The liaison performed perplexity like a man who had taken a course in it. The police did what police do when the law and the land are not friends. They made themselves the space between. Leo circled wide until his boots found a divot he hadn't seen, a slight give where the surface went from hardpan to hollow. He tapped it with the heel of his hand and felt the echo. He looked up at Tom. Tom lifted the camera. The professor came beside him and set his ear to the ground like a storybook boy. "Air," the professor said, "or void." They did not dig. They did what men in public do: measured, flagged, photographed, cited. They sent up requests like kites and waited for someone with a higher lanyard to tug. After an hour of pretending to be patient, they all knew what the result would be. Eventually, machinery would come. Eventually, the oval would cough up its silence. Eventually, someone would swear in a microphone that this had always been on the docket. Eventually is the government's favorite verb. On the drive back, Thunder walked the far ridge, but never bothered to arrive. Halfway to town, Leo pulled off the road and cut the engine. Tom waited it out, eyes on him. "I thought opening B would answer the thing in my chest," Leo said. "It didn't. It just taught it another language. How many letters like this key are in other kitchens?" Tom scratched his jaw. "Enough that a country can call it progress and believe it. Do you ever wish you'd written sports?" "Every week," Tom said, "and every week I don't." They went on. Work had a way of seeking out the daylight. The cattle reminded him of practicalities. The pump at the borehead hummed a warning he had to answer with wrenches and swearing. The kitchen developed new habits. Windows shut sooner, radio off more often, a second torch near the back door that he checked compulsively. The fear that had once chased him now learned manners and kept to its corner. Respect, not rule. Letters arrived, the kind with real postage and handwriting that leaned to one side and pressed too hard. Men who had carried steel for strangers in 1957 wrote about nights on perimeters, about the sound of generators pouring their noons into the earth. Women wrote about the recipe books that stayed open at the kitchen table while their husbands signed the documents that forgot them. A grandson mailed a photograph of his grandfather standing in front of a fence that could have been Leo's fence, only younger. In the corner of that photo, the shadow of a wheel, the edge of a hatch, or a drum, or a trick of light. He pinned the picture to the wall and told himself to be careful with the word proof. One afternoon the bank phoned, not to collect, but to apologize, indirectly, impersonally. A misapplied freeze had been reversed, accounts released. A stern conversation had apparently occurred in a room he would never see. Putting food back on a table is the neatest miracle bureaucracy knows how to perform. He thanked the caller, swore under his breath after, and closed his eyes at the sink. The water in his glass tasted faintly of iron and eucalyptus. Queensland in a mouthful. He drove out to the paddock at last light and stood where the cathedral had once been, sentry to everything that chose to remain. The new mound had grown into a proper spire, its fluted sides full of shadow. He did not tell it his plans. He simply stood long enough that his breath matched the evening. Bats shouldered the air above the creek line. A gala let out the kind of swear only a bird can get away with. Far off, thunder remembered to be thunder, and finally spoke. When the first fat drops struck the clay, a smell rose so sudden and dense it felt like a hand on his chest. Petrichor, and dust waking up. He laughed, actually laughed alone in the field, like a man who has just been told the test results came back and there's more life than doom left to spend. He tipped his face to the rain and let it find him. Back in the kitchen, he dried off and laid the key on the table again, centered on a dish his mother had used for coins. He placed beside it the photograph of his grandfather, with his serious eyes and his wartime haircut, and then the little folding Kodak he had finally developed. Prints of tunnels and benches, and labels that meant very little to anyone who hadn't learned to see the spaces in between. He arranged them in a line: past, instrument, promise. He did not add a future. He knew better than to pretend the future would sit where you told it to. That night, as the rain settled into itself, he wrote a letter to Mabel, not for posting, but for leaving his handwriting stubborn, his lines short. Meh. If the ground remembers more than people do, we should give it good things to remember. If I end up under it earlier than I chose, it won't be because I stayed quiet. If I live to plant another season, it will be because small things did the work large men pretended only they could do. If anyone asks what I did with the originals, tell them I respected the oldest bank in Queensland. L. He folded the note and slid it under the sugar tin. He went to the back door and checked the torch and the latch and the pattern of rain on the slab outside. He turned the deadbolt and felt, for the first time in weeks, that the house was not a stage, but a shelter. When he finally slept, it was the deep sleep of someone who has decided what to do next, and also decided not to do it tonight. In his dream, the cathedral stood again, 4 meters of fluted red singing quietly to itself, while the ladder descended into a circle in the ground and a siren refused to sound. He woke before dawn to the low, good sound of water in gutters and frogs rediscovering their profession. At breakfast, with the sky running bright along the edges, the phone buzzed. A message from Tom. Not a headline, not a panic, just a link and 2 words. It moved. He tapped. A photograph opened. The oval at Site C was no longer an oval. A machine had cut it into quarters at midnight, clean lines of dirt peeled back like pastry. In the center, a plate of steel too familiar to be anything else. He stared until his coffee went cold, and then colder. He looked at the key on the dish, the round tag winking a number that matched the stamped face in the photo. The tremor in his hand wasn't fear. It was recognition. He took the key. He took his hat. He stepped into morning and locked the door behind him, not because he feared what would enter, but because he honored what the house kept safe while he was gone. As he drove, the sun broke the weather like a door being opened, and the paddocks lit up in bands of gold and green and red where the soil came clear through. He checked his mirror as the highway straightened. No black SUVs, no men in borrowed names, only ordinary vehicles making unremarkable choices with their lives. At the turnout, Tom was already there, the professor beside him, the liaison counting pylons, the police talking to the rain-shiny ground as if it might declare jurisdiction. Leo idled the ute and looked at what the diggers had revealed. The hatch waited in its bed like a coin that refused to be lost. He pressed his tongue to his teeth, tasting eucalyptus and iron and coffee and a whisper he could have sworn rode the wind the same way his grandfather's voice once rode tape. Don't dig deeper than you need to. He eased the ute forward and parked. He stepped out with the key. Ready? Tom asked, not to push him, but to ask permission to witness. No, Leo said and smiled. But here we are. He knelt, brushed the wet dirt from the lip of the hatch, and set the key to the lock whose number had been waiting for it since before he was born. When metal met metal, something old in the ground hummed, no siren this time, no panic, just a low acknowledgement, like a vault recognizing its own name. He turned the key. Above them, the sky cleared another shade, and in the pause before the hinge decided whether it would behave, Leo felt the oddest sensation, not triumph, not dread continuity. As if the land had always intended for the story to be told in chapters, and the only mistake men ever made was believing any chapter was the last. He lifted. The hatch rose. The air that came up was cool and patient, the breath of a secret that had practiced waiting. He looked at Tom, at the professor, at the men with badges and the men with cameras, and then down into the dark. Let's make it loud, he said, and took the first step. This chapter ends, but the project's mystery is only beginning. If you want to know what lies behind the new hatch and where the key will lead, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Comment below what you think is hidden at Site C and what awaits Leo next. I read every theory,